in that spreadsheet and then also your model.
Okay, and I did a summary, a couple of
Okay.
summary pages too that I
Okay.
was going to share.
Awesome. So we are live. I'm going to share the PowerPoint and then Hank, you can let me know
Yeah, sure. That's great.
how you want things to go.
All right. Well, welcome back, everybody. Another subcommittee meeting for the weighted accountability model. Um, I think this is our last one before we present it to PEPSC tomorrow. So this will be our final chance to kind of tweak things before the first listen at the big meeting. And the main thing that's happened since the last time we were together was that we sent out a draft model to all of our EPPs and to our PSU partners and asked for feedback. And so we're going to talk about some of the feedback and some changes to the model based on what I was hearing kind of loud and clear from that. If you want to go ahead, Kim. Again, we know our scope of work. We're almost done at this point, which is great. But hopefully we'll have something to state board by June for them to consider. Go ahead. Yeah, we're almost there. So feedback from the field. So we asked 4 questions on a survey that was sent out. You can see that 8 PSUs responded and 31 EPPs, and that included private, public, and the non-IHE based EPPs. So that was a fairly good return rate. The first question, to what extent do the selected performance measures offer an equitable means of valuing educator preparation programs and generating data that effectively informs continuous improvement? Got plenty of feedback on this one. I guess we can go ahead and go to the next slide, Kim. I went through and tried to narrow down what I was seeing as issues that were coming up that we ought to consider. One of them was about the employer survey and whether we should put more emphasis on it. That one came from a non-IHE based EPP. So I don't know what to read into that other than they felt like that data might be more valid than some of the other measures because the principals were watching them in their schools during the time. There was only one person that said that, and I think what we had discussed up to this point was that because the employer survey has a limited return rate right now and may or may not be valid or may be affected by wanting to keep people in the PSU or in that school, that they may not be as honest in filling out those surveys, or nieces as well. So unless there's any real objection, I think we keep the weight the same on that one at this point. Kim, do you mind if I share? It might be easier to look at these. Sorry about that. Let me make sure I've got the right one up. Okay. I'm good to share. This. So this is kind of a breakdown. Can everybody see that one now? I think the main points that came through. There was one that said use more positive language, that there were areas in it that seemed less about improvement, more about sanctions. I've tried to reflect that in my new draft that I'll share with you. Accreditation equity, there were a number of small private colleges that said that this was cost prohibitive for them to join a national accreditation group, and I'm not exactly sure what to do about that. Perhaps this will help encourage those folks to or those particular institutions to put some money towards an accreditation process so that they can be a part of this as well. Um, Assessment and alignment. Okay, this was a good one. And so I made some changes to our draft because of this. So um, one institution brought up the fact that they don't prepare very many elementary teachers or none, or special ed general curriculum teachers. And so this particular measure, if it's just the Fort test, wouldn't reflect their program. So we heard from a few people that Praxis 2 ought to be kept in, and the Praxis CKT if it's going to stay as a measure. So what I've put together that I'll show you in a moment is that we would use the Pearson test, that would be the foundations of reading test and the math test. Is that correct, Andy, in there for those who are using Pearson math?
So say that again.
So the Pearson foundations of reading test, but will it also include the Pearson mathematics test for those who choose to use that instead of the CKT?
It's kind of, I mean, it can include whatever you all tell me to.
Okay. I should know if it does right now.
Okay, so if you right now, if you select in the simulator the Praxis 2 plus Pearson,
Mhm.
it is doing every content exam.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is that kind of what you were asking?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And it's kind of built in the kind of stuff around, well, if they don't offer elementary ed or whatever, then that's kind of built in, because if they don't offer it, they're not going to have
Right.
any results for that area.
Right.
But
So I thought that was a great suggestion. It made sense. There was 2 or 3 that really raised some concerns about the reliability of Ed TPA, cited a lot of research on the lack of inter-rater reliability at this point. It still technically is the only kind of nationally validated assessment that we have to use, and we all use it in our national accreditation process. I think pretty heavily to prove. So I don't know how to get around. We know that there are issues with every measure that's in here in terms of validity. So I think we're just trying to do the best we can to pick the ones that might most accurately reflect. But those concerns are heard for sure, and I appreciate that. One person said that they didn't want EVOS, or not one person, a couple of people said they didn't want EVOS or NESIS in there. Well, NESIS is not one, but EVOS, we got a lot of feedback that people felt like that was an unfair measure because of the lack of so many pieces of control and the variable of once a student was in, or an alumni was in a school teaching.
can I say one thing about that, Hank?
Yeah, please.
So I wanted to say this about that. So I read through the comments, and when people talk about, particularly for both of them, but I think they were focused on EVOS in this, when they talk about it being outside of their control, I would say, just from what the data show us, yes, from the context of like that might reflect the induction that is happening at the school, or the things that are happening after the person completes but before the EVOS. That makes a lot of sense. The part about it depending on the level of poverty at the school that the person is
Right.
working in, we have evidence that shows that does not play into the EVOS score at all. So I just wanted to, I wanted to put that out there, just as kind of a little bit of a correction on that part of the feedback. Like EVOS is not dependent on it criteria about the school related to the students, like their poverty or the minority percentage or that.
Okay, that's good. Thank you for sharing that. The other thing that we've done, of course, with the EVOS data is we weighted it at 10% of the total. So it has a pretty small impact on our composite rating. And I'll show you how this all plays out in a second. when we use this model. Small institution, throughout the comments, there were a lot of small privates that were afraid about the low numbers in their programs. How would we evaluate ones that might have 10 or less students over the course of 3 years? And I've got a suggestion for that I'm going to share with you today as well, and then see if we can come up with an idea to present. And survey representativeness, concern about low survey rates. And we had already talked about that what we would like baked into this legislation is, if it ever goes to that level, is that these employer and candidate satisfaction surveys would become part of that induction BT program, so that it has to be completed and we can get as much survey data as possible from our students and their employers. So that was question one, the main points there. Question two was, should we use traditional and residency program pathways and evaluate them separately, or should we evaluate the EPP as a single entity? There was strong support that traditional and residency programs should be evaluated separately. 13 positive comments for that, and then 4 comments for the single evaluation of the EPP as a whole. There are a couple of things that occurred to me about this. If we do them separately, which I'm certainly open to your feedback on this. If we do them separately, then for a small school, this makes them even smaller if they have those programs. So we may have to set some kind of number. You've got to have this many students in each kind of program, or you're just evaluated as a single entity. The other thing is, and I don't know, Andy, your math brain can help me, and Randy, yours too. Let's say somebody, an institution as a whole, got a composite score of 1. They were down there.
A rating.
A rating,
of 1.
yes, composite
Okay.
score rating. Yes, a rating of 1 based on their composite score. Thank you. Let's say they were down there, and then we separated out the traditional and the residency programs, and neither one was at a 1. Is that a possibility? Or maybe it's a better example. Let's say the Praxis 2 scores as a full entity didn't meet the 70% threshold or the 60% threshold that we set, but when you separated them out, each group did meet it. Is that a possibility? Is my brain, am I thinking about that weirdly?
This is Ann. Girl math would tell me I don't see how that's a possibility.
I don't think so either. I just wanted to make sure.
But Andy and Randy, I mean, one of them could be, right? You could have one if the other one came.
That's what you'd
but
want to
not
see.
both. If you're just looking at average.
Yeah, I'd have to think about it.
Yeah,
ahead,
Andy,
Randy.
does this run into Simpson's paradox? I think there are instances where weird things that you would not expect to come out, and Simpson's paradox is one example of this, where when you break things out into groups, it ends up looking quite different and not what one would expect as to when you collapse them all together.
The good news on that is, I think what Randy is saying rings a bell to me. And the good news is that we can empirically, like, we can test that, whether it's happening. And we can also, this is more my world, but like, we can do some simulations. Like, it may not be happening in the data we have today, but what is the likelihood it could happen in the future? And we can kind of get a sense of that. So I'll put that on my list just to potentially explore.
That'd be great. So if we went, go ahead, Ann. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, and couldn't we just have a caveat that if someone is less than, let's just say 10, right, which would be a federal guideline, that their total enrollment is 10 or less, that we check that? I mean, we could just have that as a caveat, that we would check their individual, like that, you know, we would still separate and make sure they weren't being biased by having them combined, I guess is what I'm saying.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Okay.
Well, we could just have it as, I mean, if we think that could even remotely be a possibility, that could be checked in the background by the Andys of the world, right?
Sure.
Hank, you raised an interesting point of, do you, one approach could be to say, if you don't meet a certain sample size threshold in, you know, in different modalities, then, or different program streams, then you would collapse it. Which is different than saying you're only going to be evaluated if you meet a certain threshold in each track. And I'm wondering from a policy perspective, what the implication would be if we set it up one way versus the other. Because you're setting, if you set it up such that if you don't have certain threshold sample sizes, we're just going to lump all the programs in together. That is sending them down a different path than other programs. So I just wanted to raise that for the group to consider as we move forward.
Yeah, it's a good point. I know, I mean, and again, thinking about the 10 students across the 3-year period from an EPP as maybe the baseline for evaluation, at least to start with. Yeah, should we just go ahead and separate them out if they do have more than one track to make sure it's, you know, not biased
Yeah.
against them?
So if it's just separated out, and then within each track, one would have to have, for example, 10 to be evaluated in that track, but then there would be no decision rule that they should be combined should you not meet those sample size thresholds.
I wonder how many of our small schools have both streams there. Would be worth taking a look at.
Well, I'll put that down.
And help.
That'd be great. So essentially, we'd be moving to every EPP who has 2 different streams would get 2 different evaluations each cycle. So it'd be EPP traditional and EPP alternative, I guess, or residency, unless they don't have both of those.
And so I haven't talked about this with you, Hank, or with anybody, but if we have time during this call, I've done some research about how to some statistical ways to kind of deal with the small n problem.
Okay.
And I wanted to put that in front of you to see if that's something that you're interested in pursuing, or just no, that's not the way to do it. So if we have time in this call, I could bring that up.
Yeah, definitely. That's on the list for us to discuss today for sure.
All right.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, question 3. Should we add anything else to it? Most people said the model had plenty in there. We did get add the math praxis CKT, which now has been added back in. There was a school that wanted us to track Pell eligible pass rates and make that a different measure, but we've removed all the subgroups from the model at this point, so I don't think adding those back in makes a whole lot of sense.
And our Pell data is not very good. We'd have to our internal.
Right. Evaluating program inputs like coursework and faculty and partnerships. And I think we've made a real move away from that over the last decade to more of outcome based at this point. Most people wanted retention excluded, and we have done that. There was a comment made about should there be some kind of extra credit for institutions who have more of their graduates going to high needs schools? I mean, I don't see any reason why that couldn't be acknowledged along the way. I don't know that it needs to be part of this model, but it could be one of the little feathers in their cap that they can say that we do this. Because I think that is obviously important. Again, the validity concerns with the different measures. And one person wanted NESIS put back in. But again, I think we've kind of discussed that one to death, that that's not the greatest measure for us to use right now. And then any other thoughts? They like that it's an improvement focus and not a punishment. They like that there's a non-public portion of this model before it ever goes public. There was some concern from the folks who are in PPAT right now who have to transition to EdTPA, that they would like some time to be able to make that transition and gather data before they would be evaluated on that. There was one person, okay, concerns with EBOS we've already talked about. Waiting the employer survey again. Bottom percent sanctions, somebody was worried that there was always going to be 25% of the entire EPP landscape that was going to be at that level 1, and that's not what we do. It is based on the composite score, which leads to that rating. And I'll show you the outcomes in a second, which I think would surprise a lot of people. Out of area, I did include this one as a special situation, and I'm not exactly sure how we get at this, but there was a concern that if we prepared somebody as, let's say, a high school social studies teacher, and because of school need, they were asked to teach science and get their license in science, and now they're teaching something we didn't train them for, that they should be excluded from the evaluation for that EPP, which I think is pretty fair. I don't know if we can do that or not, Andy, or
Well,
if we know that.
right, just a note. So we do that to the extent that we have the data possible now. For example, if they are teaching for the candidate satisfaction survey, they're asked a question, are you teaching in the field you were prepared in? If they say no, we don't include their response in the totals. Then we do the same for the employer survey. We do for EVOS, if their EVOS score is in a subject or grade that they weren't prepared for in their EPP, it is not included. And then on the license exam, then the other two measures are the license exam related ones. And I don't think that applies to those.
Okay.
Is that right? I mean, the license exams, it really wouldn't be germane what they're teaching or not teaching. It's just, do the license exams aligned with what they were prepared for, the program areas that they were being prepared for in the EPPs, and we do check that.
Okay. So if they took another Praxis 2 to add on a licensure area, we just wouldn't count that Praxis 2 score.
Right.
Okay.
That's correct.
Okay. Well, that's good.
Dr. Weddington, this is Tom Tomerman. Can I ask a question about
Yeah,
that?
of course.
So on the recent graduate survey, we're asking something like, to what extent do you feel your program prepared you to teach? Is that, I mean, I guess what I'm getting at is, if I were prepared in social studies and I got a job teaching math, is the concern that we think the candidate is interpreting, well, I did a preparation program in history and no, it didn't prepare me for teaching math? Or do we think, I mean, I guess I'm getting at, is the problem with the validity of in the way the question is constructed? Like, is it not specific enough? Like, did your pedagogical training prepare you for teaching. Yeah, I mean, is that really what we're getting at? Or because, and I'm asking this question, I'm not trying to be cute or anything. Is the pedagogical preparation that different from one subject area to another? Are we teaching people how to teach irrespective of the content? Or do we feel like our preparation programs in certain areas are so content specific that it would be invalid for a student to talk about his preparation unless he were teaching in that, he or she were teaching in that exact licensure area? Do you?
I would say yes, and I mean, obviously there's some pedagogical concepts that would go across, but there's also specific methods courses on how to teach specific content, plus a number of content courses that we require to be able to say that they're qualified to teach in that area, at least in the traditional model at that point. So I think it does. I think it would have a significant impact. I don't know how significant, but I think it's, I would not count out the fact that our math education majors do a series of courses that are specifically about math curriculum, math assessments, math instructional techniques, the newest research in math education, that those things should improve the performance of a person who comes through that program to teach math ed. Does that make sense? Randy, I don't know if you feel this.
That's helpful because I was struggling with this one a little bit. Like, I mean, my assumption would be if I were taking this survey, I would recognize the fact that I was teaching out of the area for which I was prepared, but maybe that's not a fair assumption on the part of the educator.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Okay, sure.
Hank, this is Ann, sorry.
Yes.
Taking that to a 10,000-foot level, I think one of the things that we've talked about is to review these surveys as part of this process.
Yes.
So maybe we could write that down, maybe on these surveys, we need to think about, do they need to identify what they're teaching? Is that what they were prepared in? I don't know. I think these surveys, we had talked about both surveys needing a review. So that could be part of that.
Sure. Yeah. We should
Just a
absolutely
comment.
write that down. Yeah. Thank you.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And you could also think about, as you do that, there might be things on the surveys that you're interested in asking just from a program improvement standpoint that would have nothing to do with the accountability model, right? Like we are already using just a subset of the items for accountability.
Great. Yes, I've got that down the list. Few more, some people thought that the stipulation on the model, the accountability model, that stipulation should be non-public as well. I think we've shown that there's enough time to get out prior to that through the AFIs and the notification that I don't know that we need more time at that point. I mean, the hope is that nobody gets to that point, that they'll figure out what needs to be done and make it out in the 4 years that we have allotted for them to be able to improve the program. So this was another question. This is one for the math people again. So somebody suggested that the way we're doing it right now is the 3 years of data being used, we give the greatest amount of weight to the most current year because it would reflect the most improvement. Somebody brought up the fact that if you just had a really off cohort that came through, once they got to that third year, the most current year, they would have the most impact on that whole group of people coming through. So I don't know how we handle that, how big of a change it would make if they were all weighted the same, or might be something we could look at.
I can certainly do that in both ways. There's just trade-offs. There's not a right or
Yeah.
wrong on this. You know, you could say if we weight all, you know, I would say to the same person who said that, well, if we weight all years equally and you had that bad cohort, it's going to stick with you for 3 years and have the same importance all 3 years as you cycle through. Is that what you want? You know, like, so
Yeah.
I didn't mean that in the tone I just said it, but I mean, like, there is a trade-off on
Yeah.
these things.
No, I totally agree. I just wanted to bring that up. I thought I had not thought about that before.
Do you want, I mean, is it worth the effort to run these things and look and see, well, how would it change if we did 3 equal years? Or
I don't know. Randy, Ann, y'all, do you have an opinion on that? I'm not sure it's going to make as much difference as what the person who suggested it.
What is the, like, when we say, and when this, sorry, but when we say the third year would be weighted more, what would that look like? Like, what is
so
what do we
imagine,
do, Andy?
yeah. So imagine that we're looking at the last 3 years and we're saying the last year the most recent year counts 3 times. The year before that counts twice. And the year before that counts once. So 3, 2, 1. So we're saying that the most recent year counts the most, the year before counts second most, and the 2 years ago counts the least. So the most recent year counts half, 3 out of the 6. The year in the middle counts 1/3, and the 2 years ago counts 1/6. So if I did that in my head right, it's just a weighted average over 3 years that just kind of gives precedence to the most current year. Tom, you were going to say something?
Yeah, so that approach definitely supports the idea, in what's a primary concern, I think, at DPI, and this may reflect our bias a little bit, is we've been really concerned about once a program goes into the sanction system, it almost feels like a black hole, like there's no way to pull out, because and so this would say, okay, once you know that there's a problem and you start to implement reforms and improvements to address that problem, you should get more credit in the system for showing those improvements that can help you pull out and not enter the event horizon, as it were. So I get it from that angle. From the non-low performing angle, so I think of schools that think, okay, well, wait a minute. If I have an off bad year, that's going to count 3 times in that first year, then greater than it would if it was just one of my years that's being evaluated. So that's the trade-off. And I can honestly say in our conversations, we have been much more focused about the improvement and helping folks get out of the the situation they might find themselves in, and less probably about what does a single year mean for an otherwise well-performing program that could then kind of disproportionately put them into a tailspin. So, I mean, it's a tough question, and I think,
Randy, looks like you have a thought on that.
No, it was interesting to hear Tom think through this, and I was just thinking a similar thing, that is it more beneficial to allow having the weighting, the differential weighting allows you to dig out from a tough situation, right? And is that more valuable or more important then does that avoid certain risks and errors in classification than having an equal weighting? Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. There's no right or wrong on this. I'm sympathetic to the differential weighting to allow that mechanism to for an EPP to dig out from a low rating.
We got onto that because Ann, you asked a question about how this worked. Is how it works a little bit more clear? Did we help answer that question?
Yes, I don't know if it's the right way to do it, but I do understand. And I think that I wanted people that were listening to also, I had heard
Yeah.
it, but to also hear it.
Okay, yeah, right.
So, but I don't know. I do think maybe like a small, medium, large school scenario might help us think through that, maybe. I think it's a fair question.
Mhm.
The bigger question of which one's the better way to go.
I wonder if it would be allowable, if you use the weighted model only when a program goes into some kind of corrective action. So then that triggers this kind of preference for the current system, but for those that are not in any kind of corrective action, all years are weighted equally.
I hadn't thought about that.
It's an interesting idea.
Clearly doable on the technical side and just kind of more of a policy type of decision.
Yeah, I meant, well, we're not operating off statute with this model, are we? We would have to,
Right.
Yeah, right. Sorry, I
yeah.
just meant like not a statistical question, just like we can do it if that's what you want. That's kind of what I meant.
Yeah, I like that, Tom. That's a good idea to consider for sure. I think that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so that's a good one. The last one was peer assistance. So we wrote in there that once you get to a certain level, that peers would provide assistance. There was some concern that if PEPSC is choosing these peers, what the process would be, and could we make sure that the peer selected was from a similar kind of institution, like a small private or a large public, so that the ideas that were presented were things that could actually potentially happen in that kind of school. And I would think that that would be part of our selection criteria as we looked at that. It would also depend on the availability of peers who could do that. Okay, so that was our feedback from the group. I'm going to share something else if I can get it up to the right place. So thanks to Andy's simulator, been able to run this data to see what it would look like. I can't get out now. Let me out. Oh no, I'm stuck, y'all. Hold on 1 second. No, I really am stuck. We'll see if I can pull it up this way. This is the good stuff. Okay, so if you run the data using the current model, this is what comes up right now, and this would be using the most current 3 years of data. So there are a number of EPPs without data in particular measures, and there's one that has no data in any measure across all of them. So public IHEs, are all fine that way. Private IHEs, you can see that there are 9 total private IHEs that show up as not having data in one or more of the different measures. And then for the non-IHEs, there are 5 total that show up across those measures of not having data. And that meant 0 data, right, Andy? Even if they had 1 person, they were counted this time.
Yeah, that's what we did, not as a not from a standpoint of saying like that's the way it should be, but that was just to start with that. And then if you all want to add some minimum kind of thing, we can certainly do that.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. So then looking at each measure and how many EPPs didn't meet our thresholds, you can see for EdTPA, there was 1 public and 1 private. For EBOS, there was 1 private. And for Praxis 2/Pearson, there were 2 publics. And that's it total across all of the institutions right now. All of the EPPs, sorry. None of the non-IHEs, but to be fair, a lot of the non-IHEs had no data at all. So that in these areas. And then the composite score breakdown. So the composite score rating breakdown, sorry, make sure I say that each time. There were 14 public that were exemplary, 24 private, and 3 non-IHE. You can see the numbers here. I think the important numbers are the 2 and the 1. There were 2 privates and 1 non-IHE, and you can see there was 1 private IHE with no data for any measure, so they got a 0. So that's why they are in that category right now. And 1 private that only had data for 1 measure in that. Same with the non-IHE, it only had data for 1 measure, so it was getting 0s for everything else. So whatever we decide to do with the small school, I think would take care of some of that. The same was true for the developing private IHEs. Typically, it was based solely on not having enough data in there to actually be able to give them credit for the things they needed. So when I don't know how you feel about this, and I would entertain from EPP and from our public school folks what this looks like to you as you look at it. If this seems like it's a fair kind of a outcome model, if it's too good of an outcome, too bad of an outcome, I'm open.
If it helps at all, I think if I remember right, Hank, the kind of denominator is 55 or something like that. So if you're trying to say like, well, so how many total people are in needs
Right.
improvement, it would be the 2 plus 1, so 3 out of 55. If it helps you.
I think this looks good to me. And one thing that I'm thinking of is as we're proposing something, if we have to hedge one way or the other, I mean, we want the model that we feel best represents, right, our intention from a policy perspective. And if we have to hedge one way or the other, I would pick a model that is going to minimize errors of classification in the negative realm if we're starting out with a new model. So, but I do want to preface this that we want a model that works, that helps us do what we want to do. And if we're balancing one type of error, having people classified as needing improvement versus an error of classifying someone as exemplary, a program as exemplary when really maybe they're just strong, I would hedge towards reducing the errors on the incorrectly classifying programs as needs improvement when really they don't. If that makes sense.
It does. Yeah. Thank you. No, all of this, obviously doesn't have it broken out into traditional versus residency programs. So I'm not sure how that would impact this, but we can look at that when that's available to us. I feel good about this. I feel like if the EPPs saw this breakdown, that they would maybe not have as much fear about the system right now and believe that it really is trying to help create some kind of a continuous improvement process as opposed to a gotcha process.
I agree.
Yeah, me too. I think that this is Anne. I think that, and I've said this to you, Hank, but I think one thing that I still hedge on is I do wonder about the thresholds being broken out for the Pearson versus the Praxis. That even if it's one score, would it be best to have? Are we hiding data if we don't have a threshold for Pearson and a threshold for the Praxis too? Are we hiding something that an EPP might need to improve on? I do wonder about that. I'm fine with them together for the score. I don't know that I'm fine with them together for the threshold. But I agree with the former statement about the error and all that. I'm just talking about when we get down to looking to the sub pieces.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess I totally hear what you're saying. And I guess the only question there would be for those schools that don't prepare elementary or special ed general curriculum. If they got a 0 for the Pearson, we'd have to do something to make sure that that was not included.
Yeah, when they get a null though, like an NA, like not a 0.
We'd have to do something like that. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then their weights would it would look different as well, because we really have to separate out. I think we gave Praxis Pearson. No.
I don't know that I would
No.
do the
Yeah.
percentage. I would just maybe do the threshold.
Just the threshold. Okay.
Just the threshold, because just because we're in a continuous improvement model, which is what the part of this that I think is very positive. I don't want to hide data from people. Not that they couldn't improve anyway on an area and look at their sub scores or whatever, but I do think that is what when I think about this model, what we're leading with. So if that's what we're leading with, but that's my opinion. So it's one person.
Yeah, I would love to hear other.
So can I just restate what I think, Ann, you're saying, just to see if I'm following? So the idea would be that, so right now, I believe the success rate for the Pearson plus Praxis is 60%. Right? Like
that's the threshold. Yeah.
Correct.
Right. And you're saying that the threshold there might be one threshold for Pearson and another threshold for Praxis, but that together they would still amount to, I forgot now what they come out to. Is it
10%?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah.
correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Because if we're trying to, again, if the idea is about continuous improvement, I guess I'm asking the question, I think there's a difference when you look at the data. There seems to be a difference. And I don't want to hide the data in a way that people aren't having to write to continuously improve on something that they need to continuously improve on. That's where and that includes everyone. That's not I just think it's something to consider if that's what we're leaning into. But again, other people might say it doesn't really make a difference, or like, I'm not sure it's worth it, or, there's a lot of counter arguments to my argument, but because I know when we had just Pearson data, I believe I believe that number would be higher at people not meeting the threshold.
I think that's right. I'm pulling it up right now.
Yeah.
So I can,
So again, I'm okay with the combo score of the 10%. And then I'm okay with a null for, because again, if you just have a secondary program, you would only have Praxis 2 data because that's really all you're going with. It's really the Pearson data.
yeah. So it looks like there would have been 8 EPPs who would have been under the threshold for Pearson and only 1 for Praxis 2. And both of those have seven missing datas, 7 EPPs missing data. So yeah, that would take it up significantly if those
Yeah.
were broken up. I don't know. Thoughts from any other committee members?
Sounds good to me, what Ann has proposed.
Okay.
And and I'm not gonna probably articulate it as well as Dr. Penfield did, but I'm very much in agreement with the point that he made that if there is a potential for error, that it would go in the direction of more favorable than not.
Thanks, Craig.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with that as well.
So this would definitely move it towards less favorable in terms of the overall scoring, but it would highlight that particular Pearson examination in a way that it's not when it's combined with the Praxis 2. And let me just see how many are involved. So that would be, it would be 3 public institutions and keep processing. 4 privates. And it would have to be 1, yep, 1 non-IHE. Would you like for me to go ahead?
Not a composite score thing.
Say that again.
Different. I'm sorry. I said that's a threshold, right? Not a composite score.
Yeah,
Because of the combined, it would so the overall score would stay whatever that is from the average of all of it.
right.
But it would point out particular data. And I think it's because every other criteria too stands alone, and this one's a combined criteria. That's my only piece that I'm still in my head or thinking that around the, because it's the threshold only.
Sure.
I mean, I don't know. I think as like an outside person, which I'm not, but I'm just trying to think, I'm not clear why pull those apart. To me, they're content license exams. And why separate by the vendor / the subject area? Like, what would, if you presented this to the state board and someone asked that question, what would be your reasoning?
I think because for me, when you look, I think it hides the data of the performance on the literacy exam. And that what's hidden is that there are a lot more EPPs. There's 4 times as many EPPs that are, if I'm right on that, there's 7 EPPs that need to improve based on this data in the literacy exam world. There's 1 EPP that needs to improve on Praxis 2 world. So to me, you're not presenting with where it's hiding data that might need, with the emphasis on literacy in North Carolina. I wonder if it's hiding data that needs to be highlighted.
I get you.
That's my whole.
Okay,
thing.
no, I hear you. That makes sense.
Yeah.
So then,
Yeah.
Hank, when you were doing when you were coming up with the kind of alternative numbers, were you using the Pearson or the Foundations of Reading category?
Oh, I use the Pearson. Let me.
So that doesn't, yeah.
Okay.
So if the real concern is the literacy, then let's make it Foundations of Reading only.
Okay, let's see what that is for all. Oops.
Randy,
Yeah,
say
no.
so. I can see what you're saying.
Well, so, and I'm wondering is what you're saying is that the way it's currently set up, if they're pulled together, one can compensate for a weakness in another.
Yes, that's very nice, Randy. I like that language.
And that would get to that compensation would the word you're using is kind of hiding the data, right? But it's
Yeah.
hiding a result there because you're able to compensate with a strength on another assessment.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's what if we want to do that, right? Or do
Yeah.
we want to have it clear? It's great language. Thank you.
And it stays the same, Andy, from what I'm looking at. 8
Okay.
schools that don't make it on the Foundations
So,
of Reading.
all right. So so to Ann's point, then what's driving the low scores among the Pearson is not the Pearson math. It doesn't seem like it's the Pearson reading.
Right.
Okay.
Okay, so shall I separate those out for presenting it to PEPSC tomorrow? Is everybody okay with that?
Does it mean then that each one, if combined, they're worth 10%? Does it mean that individually they'd each be worth 5%? Or am I
I
not
think-
thinking about that correctly?
I think that they can just all average to be 10%. Because maybe you have more praxis than peers. It just depends on your program. But I don't, and I know that this is getting down to math, but I'm thinking I was thinking threshold only and letting it stay at 10% combined. Because if we get to 5%, then if you don't have Pearson, it gets into I was just thinking the threshold for the continuous improvement part, not the composite percentage.
That might make it a little bit easier.
Yeah.
For the clarity. It might make it easier for the people to understand what's feeding the composite, the composite weight. If we kept it like that and then make it like we're counting up individual EPPs that are below a threshold for the Foundations of Reading test. Like that is one of the inputs to that count. Okay.
Yeah.
And that makes sense to me. Thanks for hanging in with the questions. I just was trying to, I think I get where you're coming from now, and that I hear you.
Look, I have great respect for you and Randy's math head.
Yes.
So if this is not making any sense, then I appreciate the pushback, but I don't. Compensating is a great way to think about it.
Okay. So the composite score ratings would stay the same because we'd still combine praxis and Foundations of Reading for that piece of it, but we would have two measures at the top. And should an institution not prepare elementary or special ed general curriculum, they would just get some kind of NA so that they wouldn't be dinked for not meeting that measure. Is that possible, Andy?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay, that's good work. Love it. All right, any other questions on this part of it? I'll pull up the last thing because I think we definitely need to talk about the small school issue. So, oh boy. There I go again. share the newest version of the model. Not a lot has changed, but I tried to highlight the parts that I went in and changed. Traditional and residency programs within the same EPP will be evaluated separately. I put if numbers allow here, and I don't know how we're going to want to go with that. I guess when we get down to the small school piece, we could decide what would make the most sense there. And then some language about what the threshold actually means that Andy suggested so that people understood what we were doing. Here, this will change because we're going to bust these out. So I'll make a note in each one to say if you're not preparing candidates in an area that takes this examination, you will not be scored for that piece of it, and it will not affect your composite score rating. Something along those lines. Nothing changed here. I tried to make some friendly language changes because these were pretty negative. So stipulation is if the EPP needs continued support beyond the AFI period to meet improvement targets, or if significant performance challenges are recognized, the program will move into a phase of enhanced collaboration and public accountability to ensure positive growth, as opposed to be put on a sanction, I think is kind of where we were. And the next one's exactly the same. It's a stipulation instead of AFI. Anybody opposed to making that language nicer? Okay. So nothing changed there. This is what we've already discussed. The 3-year data set is currently weighted, with the most recent year receiving the primary weight. And do you like the idea of that being triggered by a notification, or do you want to leave it as is for now? And
This is the issue of the weighting being triggered.
right, so do
Right.
you make each year equal, or?
I haven't given it much thought, but with Tom's recommendation, I like that recommendation that
Okay.
the weighting would be triggered by. It seems to allow us the best of both worlds.
Yeah,
The
I
only
like
other
that.
thing, the only
Yeah.
other thing I thought about since Tom mentioned that is you could take it just a step further and say we compute 2 3-year averages for each person, one that's weighted and one that is equal years, and we take the higher of the two. And that way we're not waiting for somebody to get into a continuous improvement. If they are truly improving, then the data is going to reflect that. If it's a one-off bad year, we're giving them the benefit of the doubt. Do you follow what I'm saying?
Yes.
This down, sorry. Wait and weight it and take the best.
I will say at this point that I do appreciate the DPI staff's work, because we're making this, like, we're going to give y'all some work on this model if this ever comes to fruition. So we appreciate that.
Okay, nothing.
I'm wondering on that point though, if we assume Andy's approach that, that you both are computed, the highest one is taken, and then given that this is going to PEPSC tomorrow, does it give you an opportunity to say, this is what was proposed, we did deliberate on this, and then you would have PEPSC's recommendation and feedback on that?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And Randy, just to be clear, discussion tomorrow, won't vote on it till May.
Got it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Just
perfect. Yeah.
awareness.
Because there's not a huge time difference between now and tomorrow's Pepsi meeting, if we in tomorrow's meeting, if you have a way, and I'll take notes, but if we could kind of generate questions that we could try to look at the data to see, like we started already in this meeting, a few, then maybe at some interim time between tomorrow's meeting and the meeting where you want to vote on it, you said in May, Ann, is that right? Like, in the interim of those two meetings, we could get people the answers to those questions.
Yeah. And if we needed to, if we get a lot of questions, we can always, hold a special session if we needed to, but, our special meeting, but yes, the goal is, our timeline is to have it to the state board by June, which means that we have to have it out of our queue. But so tomorrow is the first discussion, and then May will hopefully be the second in line. And, and again, this isn't in law anywhere, so this is taking it forward to see what they think.
Okay. The only thing I changed here was language again. So taking it from a negative to a positive spin for the different categories at the top. And the same below, taking it away from more of a deficit model to opportunities exist for improvement, as opposed to you didn't make it.
It's a very asset-based framing, Hank.
I think that's fair. I think it's what we try to do with our students as well, to teach them to be like that in the classroom. So we ought to model it in policy. Okay. So nothing else changed there. Before we get to the special situations, which I know we don't have a lot of time left, any questions or comments on that? Are you happy with it staying as is for now with the adjustments to language?
I'm in support.
Yeah, I'm
Great.
good on that.
Is it good with you? Okay, special situations, and you can say no, yay to any of this. The first one was an attempt to catch something, that there is the possibility that somebody could be put into, the corrective action because they don't have 3 measures meeting, or their composite score rating is a 1, and then they could get out the next year, but then go back in for the next couple years. So I didn't know if we needed something in there to say that once you're placed on probation 3, which started that corrective action model, that they'll remain at this status until, that if the EPP receives a composite score of 1 or has 3 identified areas for development, 3 out of a 5-year period, that we would keep them in that corrective action piece, so as to not be able to jump out for a year and start the whole process over again. But I don't know that we need that necessarily. And I would entertain any comments on that.
Hey, don't kill me while people are reading this, but on this slide, you've got that composite score language,
Oh,
like
yeah.
where we need to put the
Oh,
rating
no, I
part
caught
in.
all those. Okay. Let me write that note too. Thank you. Okay, well, I'll leave it for now, and then maybe PEPSC will have some feedback on whether or not they feel like that's necessary to have in there. It probably won't happen, but that's what I think about. Okay, so now the small school. I talked to a number of deans from smaller institutions and talked to NCICU staff as well, and tried to think about how we could deal with this issue. But I'm really interested to hear also what Andy has thought about from a statistics point of view. What we kind of got to was that if an EPP graduates fewer than 10 total completers over the 3-year evaluation period, the resulting performance measure is likely won't provide a valid basis for assessing program performance. In such instances, NCDPI will implement the following procedures. Notification to the EPP of insufficient data, an evaluation waiver for that year of evaluation and that cycle. The EPP then has to provide an improvement plan within 60 days, listing strategies that they're using to increase enrollment and graduation rates and retention to a level that permits meaningful data analysis and future evaluations. And in subsequent years, until they get where they need to be, they would report on the outcomes of those strategies, like, as part of the IHE report. I put in here that you could receive a maximum of 2 consecutive evaluation waivers while you're trying to work on your enrollment and growth. And then after those 2 waivers, you have an option of using extended historical data that goes back as far as possible to get as close to possible to 10 completers, and use that for evaluating the program. Or you could choose to use just the current cohort of people that are out there right now. So if you only had 5 completers that were being evaluated as part of this cycle, those 5 would carry the burden for the entire EPP. And that's kind of as far as we got in thinking through that. But this is a tough one. So I'd love all the feedback possible here on how we should think about this.
So the one thing that, so I did kind of a deep dive on Monday and Tuesday to look at other situations where this comes up. And this actually comes up a lot. And it came up a lot in education when the No Child Left Behind Act happened, and they had small subgroups and how to deal with that. And there's trade-offs on all of them. One is certainly establishing a minimum in something that you could or so, in other words, like a minimum of 10 or what have you. Another option that you could do in lieu of that, or in addition to that, is to compute confidence intervals on the composite rating. And I read some stuff and figured out how to do that. And the premise is that right now, the way that we're doing it, we're not taking into account any uncertainty around the numbers, right? Like, imagine if, like, we're treating it like if they did a political poll or something like that, and they just said 47% said agree, blah, blah, blah. And they did know, like, plus or minus, 3 points or whatever. We can calculate what the plus and minuses would be for these things, and the pluses at the intervals around the things are going to be larger for the smaller things, meaning there's more uncertainty. So a smaller EPP, instead of us coming up with the number, like, we might come up with the number 30%, 30 for their composite score from 0, but because they're small, we'd say that we think it's 30, but it could be in the range of 10 to 50, for example. And if you do that, then you'd say, if the lower end of that range, that lower end of that range, or sorry, the upper end of that range would have to be lower than the 25% to get them into that level 4 area. So as long as they'd have to be their range would have to be completely under the bottom line for them to be considered in that bottom line. Does that make statistically, you can do that, and I think it's not a controversial thing. Like it's known, and I could offline kind of go over with Randy like exactly like how that would work. It won't mean anything. It would be hard to explain to people. That's a disadvantage of it. I mean, in terms of like people replicating it at home, for example, would be kind of hard probably. But that's one idea that people have done, and some states did that with their No Child Left Behind, etc. And Randy, you had a
So just thanks, Andy, for that. That's an interesting idea. One thing I'm wondering is if we're dealing with really small sample sizes, the confidence intervals are going to be massive, right? Like
They
if you have
are.
a sample size of 5, right? So is it, even given how large we expect that they would be, could you ever even be a 1? Like, because the interval would probably surpass.
Yep. When
I'm just wondering.
Yeah. So I did a simulation yesterday, but it's not ready for prime time.
Yeah, that's
but
interesting idea.
But when I did it yesterday, we would be down to 1. I think we have 3 now when we were looking at it that were in the level 1. And I think when I did it, it went from 3 to 1. And I think that the 1, it was happening mostly because they had no data and they were getting treated as 0. And so then the confidence, a 0 doesn't contribute, a null value doesn't contribute to the confidence interval. So anyway, that's, that may be too in the weeds, but I just wanted to offer that I would say that a major flaw of the current model related to small schools is not taking into account the uncertainty, particularly around, you think like the survey measures, which naturally kind of lend themselves, even the EVOS, et cetera. And this would be a way at getting at that. Hank, when you asked me to look, so the minimum in, setting that at 10 or whatever we decide, we can do that. And we're going to have a group of schools that are going to be, then get this notification, whatever. We do have whatever we choose for that, we're going to have schools that are just above that line as well. And so like, I think Hank, when you did it, I think there were maybe like 3 or 4 additional ones that were somewhere between 10 and 20.
Right.
I can't remember exactly.
There were 3, yeah.
So they're not, the 10 to 20 group is not that different than the 5 to 10 group or 0 to 10, right? I mean, from a uncertainty standpoint. But did I lose? I don't know what you think of that. If I lost you, if it's too late in the game. But I wanted to throw that out as a potential option.
Andy, do you think you could write that up in like simply with like a little scenario or a little example?
I do.
Before tomorrow at 3:30. Yeah, probably to 3:45 or 3.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's not
Yeah.
it's not hard to write up, just in regular language.
Yeah.
What's happening. I think it's the issue is going to be more for you all to decide, does that introduce a level of, it's like I think that what we'd be showing is more true than what we have if we don't do it, but it also might be more confusing to people, in which case we've sacrificed a little bit of clarity, you know, for what might be a small gain or something. I don't know how to determine that trade-off.
I wonder too where we would want to set that total in to use. I could see an institution who had 25 as compared to one that's got 300 completers out there saying, well, my data can't be as reliable either. So I'd like the confidence measures applied. I don't know where the cutoff is there, or
Well, I think what you would do under the confidence interval thing, you would just have that for everybody.
we would start
And
it with whoever the largest we would assume is the most confidence.
Well,
Is that-
yeah, I mean, everybody gets a confidence interval, and the programs that are large are going, their confidence intervals are going to be like this. You've seen these.
Yeah.
If I'm not, I don't have a picture, but just imagine, like, usually it's like a dot with a line through the dot, and the
Right.
length of the line is showing you kind of the plus or minus. And you're saying the score could be, we're reasonably confident the score is somewhere in that range, kind of. So the bigger programs, like Randy's program, is going to have probably all in all a smaller line. Ann's program will be a little bit bigger. The super small private is going to be a lot wider. Kind of the way that would work. Does that make sense? And then you just.
Would be interesting. I wonder if anybody would ever fall below the 25% line.
Andy, you would do this on the weighted composite?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and then yeah. So then, yes, it would be interesting to see what that would look like. Because that would then impact who's getting into which rating level, right? Like if you're using where your confidence interval.
Well,
demands
yes,
our
we would
confidence
have to. That's right. We would have to
Yeah.
decide, or, I say you all
Yeah.
would have to decide if you want to, if you wanted to apply that confidence interval. Everybody's got a confidence interval, but you might only use it to determine whether or not somebody's in level 1 or not.
Yeah.
And otherwise they're in their,
They're wherever their
Wherever they
point
are.
estimate is. Yeah. Yeah.
And this wouldn't affect the threshold measures at all. That would still just be. Okay.
It doesn't really affect everything that you've done in the model. It doesn't really affect. It's just creating that composite score is now kind of has a range to it, as opposed to just a range around the number that we've been using. Randy?
Yeah, and you could have a process where you only invoke that range under certain circumstances
Mhm.
for making decisions.
That's right.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. That's something new to think about, Andy.
Yeah,
Thanks-
sorry to
thanks for
spring
doing
that on you.
research.
It took a while to figure out. Okay. Well, what I'll do here's my takeaway. So for you all, I will have a paragraph of text for that that you can use tomorrow if you'd like. And then in the meantime, to show you all, I can show you what it would look like with our current proposed, with the current proposed model, what it would look like. How's that?
That would be
Like the
awesome.
confidence ranges, and then you could kind of take a look.
Yeah, it'd be great. Thank you for doing that. Okay, so that's great. There were only two other things. I just put a clause in about if you lose your national accreditation status, then you become a non-accredited, and you go back onto public sanctions are a possibility. And then a clause about, we talked about this already, if you're teaching out of your area that you were prepared for by the EPP, that those would not be included in the evaluation process, to the extent that we can figure that out for sure. So that's kind of where we are with the changes. I need to put rating into that one place. We're going to bust out the foundations of reading tests and the praxis 2 into 2 separate measures, but they would come back together as the plus for the composite score rating.
Scroll up, Hank, to your table of the measures. And I want to just make sure that I'm thinking of this the right way.
Okay.
So what I'm thinking is, like, you would have this where it says Pearson plus Praxis 2.
Mm-hmm.
You would have one row for Pearson. Well, one row technically for foundations of reading.
Right.
One row for all other content exams. So like Pearson Math plus the Praxis 2. I'm saying this back to see if this is the spirit of what we said. Those are going to have individual measure thresholds. But then that composite score weight is going to be like a merge, like it is going to be a merge cell. So it's going to be, it won't be 2 different rows
Right.
for this.
Right.
It's still,
It'll
that
just be a
part is going to
10%.
be 10%. Is
Yeah.
that what you're?
That's what I was thinking. Yeah.
Okay. And that corresponds with what you were thinking?
Yes,
Okay.
I believe so. Yes.
Okay. All right. Got it on that one. Then I've got some language to add about that we would measure, or we would use 3 years of evaluation data, and we would look at it with equal weight given to each year, and then also weighted to see which gave the best to the institution. Is that where we landed on that?
I think so.
Okay. Well, I can make all of those changes and have that ready for tomorrow. So any other questions, concerns, anything else we need to dig into in the last, oh, we're at time, so.
Hank, thanks for all that you're doing.
Yeah, thank
Mhm.
y'all. for all
Andy,
the
you
thought.
too.
Well,
Hey.
thank you all.
Yeah, this
Hank.
is, I think we're getting there.
Yeah,
Hank, this is Kim. Did you want to send that to me
yes,
and I can send that out or?
yep. I'll try to
Okay.
get it done this afternoon and get it to you, or if not, first
Fantastic.
thing in the morning.
Okay. Thanks, Hank.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, thanks, everybody. I hope you have a great afternoon.
All right.
Yep.
Y'all too. Bye.
Bye-bye.
See you later.